Chapter 30. The Truth of the Matter. Are you willing to believe that love is the strongest thing in the world? Stronger than hate? Stronger than evil? Stronger than death? Henry Van Dyke. Chris was angry, uncharacteristically so. Perhaps it was the fear of raiders in the area. The Franklin family, not more than a mile away, all dead. It brought back all too familiar memories. Dead, staring eyes, the violation of the women and the stench of death. Would he ever escape this endless cycle of death? Would he ever be able to unsee the terrible sights he had been witness to? The boy hadn't said or done much of anything, just made a joke, and Chris had strode off into the house, unable to think, to speak past the blinding hatred he felt rising up inside him. What had Jess been thinking, keeping a reminder like that near her all of these years? Jacob was a carbon copy of the man, except for his cran-blue eyes, of what had come to be the main character in his worst nightmares. He fought for control. Carrie didn't understand. Jess didn't. None of them did. God, how many times had he dreamed of Jess dead by that monster's hand? Finding her alive, realizing that he had his sister back, that she had been here for years rebuilding her life, even as the ghosts from their previous life haunted her. How could she stand to look at that boy? How could she force those words, "I love you," out of her mouth? He heard a soft tread behind him, and Jess's hand reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "He didn't mean to make you angry, Chris. He's just a boy." "He's rude," Chris ground the words out. "A real smartass." Even saying the words, he knew they weren't true. He knew his emotions were colored by the past, by what was long gone. He had tried so hard to close off this anger, to recognize that the boy wasn't to blame, but it was all too much. The way the kid's lips had twisted, almost in a snarl, reminded him of blood and death and darkness, months of it, and the years of grief that had followed. How could he look at that boy and see anything else but that? Jess couldn't understand where all of this anger was coming from. Chris had never been like this. He'd been kind and patient. Why did her brother hold such animosity towards Jacob? Above all, she wanted peace. They were all family, all together now for the first time in years, underneath one roof, an impossible and beautiful thing. Why was he being this way? "Chris," Jess fought to keep her tone even. "Please understand." "Understand what, sis? That raping bastard is his father? That damned Lieutenant Scott Cooper destroyed your life? That Jacob was born because an evil man who raped and murdered countless women put his seed into you?" Jess stood in shock. "You know?" Chris practically snarled. "How could I not know? Looking at him is like seeing that bastard's face over and over and over again. It makes me sick, seeing what he did to you, knowing what you went through." Her tongue felt heavy, unwieldy, and she couldn't form the words to explain that Jacob was nothing like Scott Cooper, that he was good, that she loved him more than she had ever loved anything else, more than life itself. "Chris, you don't know what it's like. Jacob is my son. I love him. He's not like that monster, he isn't." Her brother stared at her, his mouth turned down at the edges. "For Christ's sake, Jess, how could you stand to keep him? After what happened to you? Knowing who his father was? Hell still is, for all we know. We never caught him. How can you stand to look at him knowing what Jacob is?" There was a small sound behind them, a soft scuff of shoes on the worn floorboards, and Chris and Jess turned to see Jacob, his eyes round, full of anguish and betrayal. Jess gasped in horror. The very thing she had dreaded happening had occurred. She had told no one, not even Sarah Turner. David hadn't even known who it was, although he had sussed out the overall idea of it all long ago. "Jacob, oh, baby, no, listen to me, The boy was already backpedaling out the door. "You told me my dad had died. You said he—" Overwhelmed by the sheer horror of his origins, he turned and fled, quickly disappearing into the dark night. Jess screamed after him, "Please, Jacob, please wait, I can explain." She turned back to Chris, her face chalk white. "How could you, Chris? How could you? He's my son. It doesn't matter who his father is. It doesn't matter, because he's my son and I love him. That's all we ever needed. Love. Oh, how could you possibly understand?" And she ran then, shoving past him, running blindly into the night. Chris took a step to the doorway to follow her, to try and help, as Carrie arrived. She had heard everything. She reached out a hand, firmly grasping his arm. Her face was hard, tight with anger. "Let them go, Chris. You've done enough, don't you think?" "Carrie, I didn't mean for him to hear that," he said, taken aback by her fury. Seeing her face made him realize how his dislike of the boy must look to the others. They couldn't understand. They didn't see him like that. They didn't see Scott Cooper sneering out at him through that face. What Carrie and the others saw was his unreasonable disgust and contempt for his sister's only biological child, a boy who had done nothing to him. Jacob didn't deserve this. Chris watched her go, a sickness rising up inside him. What had he done?